I thought I came here to be alone, to hide from everything, from people, from noise, from myself. But then he sat next to me on the porch, and somehow, silence wasn't empty anymore. The cabin was smaller than he'd expected, tucked into the shoulder of a pine-covered hill. It stood quietly against the soft hum of wind and the distant rush of a stream. Marcos Vale stepped out of his rental car and stared at it for a moment, one hand still resting on the door handle. The air was crisp, laced with wood smoke and something faintly floral he couldn't name. He hadn't planned to come here. It had been a suggestion from a colleague, half joking, half serious. "You're going to burn out completely if you don't disappear for a while," they'd said. And so he had. A 3-month sabbatical. No lectures, no emails, no manuscript revisions. Just time and silence. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. A worn leather chair, a wooden desk that looked handmade, a kitchenette with a humming fridge and mismatched dishes. Marcos unpacked slowly, stacking books on the windowsill, placing his laptop untouched on the desk, folding clothes into drawers that smelled faintly of cedar. The first 2 days passed in near total quiet. He walked the trails behind the cabin in the morning, made simple meals, tried, without much success, to write. At night, he sat on the porch with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching the stars sharpen in the darkening sky. There was peace in the routine, but also a strange hollowness he hadn't expected, as though he'd brought the weight with him. On the third afternoon, he decided to explore the gardens below the hill. A map in the welcome folder labeled the area as restoration grounds. Apparently, a local initiative was underway to revive the old botanical sections, paths once overgrown now being cleared and replanted. He followed a narrow trail, winding through low ferns and scattered stone markers, until he saw someone crouched near a wooden gate, adjusting a section of broken fencing. The man didn't hear him approach. He moved with the kind of quiet precision that comes from habit. His clothes were smudged with dirt, his hair pulled back loosely, a streak of sun across the back of his neck. Marcos paused, uncertain if he should interrupt, then shifted his weight and made the gravel crunch beneath his boot. The man looked up. Their eyes met only briefly, long enough for Marcos to register something calm and unreadable in the man's expression, before the stranger stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. A nod was exchanged. No smile, but not unfriendly either. Just neutral. Marcos made a vague gesture toward the garden and mumbled something about admiring the work. The man nodded again, said it was a long-term project, then turned back to his task. Marcos stayed a moment longer, unsure why, then walked back toward the cabin. That night, he couldn't focus on his reading. The man's face kept returning to him. Not because of anything remarkable, but because of how present he had seemed. Grounded, in a way Marcos hadn't felt in months. Maybe longer. Over the next few days, they crossed paths again. Once near the supply shed, once by the greenhouse where the air was warm and damp. Each time, their exchanges were short, practical. But something began to shift. The man, whose name, according to a clipboard hanging on the shed, was River Sloan, started nodding first when he saw Marcos. On the fifth encounter, he pointed out a trail that led to a quiet overlook near the creek. Marcos followed it that afternoon. The overlook was shaded by tall trees and carpeted with moss. He sat there for hours, listening to water move over rocks, letting his thoughts settle into something slower. That evening, River was on the porch of the greenhouse, coiling a hose. Marcos passed by with no intention of stopping, but River paused, nodded toward a bench, and said something about the weather turning. His voice was low, a little rough, like someone who didn't speak often but meant what he said when he did. They sat for a while, not talking, not really, just sharing space. The sky above them turned lavender, then navy. Marcos could feel the tension he always carried between his shoulder blades and his hands ease slightly. It wasn't gone, but it didn't feel as heavy. When he returned to the cabin that night, the silence felt different, less like absence, more like possibility. For the first time since arriving, he opened his laptop, not to write the paper that waited impatiently in his files, but to start a new document. He titled it simply, Observations. He didn't know yet what the story would become, but something had shifted, quietly. without fanfare. And it had started with a glance across an unfinished garden and the stillness of someone who wasn't trying to fix him. Just being there had been enough. The days began to fall into rhythm. Quiet mornings filled with cool air and misted windows. Afternoons that drifted past like slow-moving clouds. Marcos found himself waking earlier than usual. No alarms, no urgency. Just the soft pull of light through the curtains and the steady presence of silence. He walked often, not far, just enough to feel the texture of the forest underfoot, to let his thoughts unravel in the hush between birdsong and breeze. The air here had a kind of clarity that made him aware of every breath, every sound. Even the creak of the cabin floorboards at night seemed less like intrusion and more like conversation. River Sloane continued to appear in the periphery of his days, sometimes near the greenhouse, hauling bags of soil or tending to rows of seedlings under shade cloth. Sometimes near the stream, where he moved rocks into neat patterns with a quiet concentration that suggested deeper purpose. They didn't talk much. Their conversations were brief, practical, the kind you have with someone you don't yet know, but whose presence feels familiar. Still, a subtle understanding seemed to form between them, not through words, but through shared space. One afternoon, Marcos returned from a walk to find a book resting on the porch railing. No note, just a dog-eared paperback of poetry with faded cover art and pencil marks in the margins. He flipped it open. The initials RS were scribbled inside the front cover. He read half of it that evening, sitting on the edge of his bed, the cabin lit by a single lamp that hummed faintly. The poems weren't flowery or sentimental. They were stripped down, quiet, like the forest outside. He thought of the way River moved, measured, deliberate, and realized the book made sense in his hands. The next day, he returned it silently, leaving it in the same place. A few mornings later, River approached him near the trailhead with a small thermos and 2 cups. The gesture was simple, casual. They drank without saying much. The coffee was strong, the air smelled of pine, and something about it all felt quietly significant. That afternoon, the sky shifted. Heavy clouds gathered and brought a slow, unhurried rain that tapped gently against the windows. Marcos sat inside, watching the drops trail down the glass in winding patterns. He could see River moving through the garden, wearing a worn jacket, his movements undisturbed by the weather. Later, as evening settled in, Marcos stepped outside, drawn by the sound of the rain softening. River was sitting on the greenhouse steps, arms resting loosely on his knees, gaze lost somewhere beyond the trees. Marcos joined him without a word. The bench was damp, but neither of them cared. They sat in silence as the last of the rain faded into mist, the world around them wrapped in that strange quiet that follows a storm. River spoke first. Not a question, just a sentence about how the ground always breathes better after rain. Marcos nodded, unsure if a reply was needed. The statement wasn't about weather. It was about release, renewal. They stayed like that until the light was almost gone. In the cabin that night, Marcos pulled out a notebook and wrote for hours. Not about quantum structures or theoretical systems, but about presence, about the way silence can stretch between two people and become something more than empty space. He wrote about the way stillness can feel like safety when shared. In the following days, their rhythm continued. Coffee, walks, shared glances across open spaces. Marcos began to notice the smallest things. How River rolled his sleeves exactly halfway. How he hummed under his breath when focused. How he tilted his head slightly when thinking. It wasn't infatuation. It wasn't even clarity. It was something unspoken beginning to take shape. Something that lived in pauses, in gestures, in the way one person can slowly become part of another's day, without effort. One evening, Marcos sat on the porch, blanket over his shoulders, notebook in his lap. The air had turned crisp. He heard footsteps behind him, then the familiar creak of the third porch plank. River didn't sit, but stood near the railing, looking out. There was a long silence. Then, very quietly, River said he used to be a journalist. The words hung in the air. A confession, or maybe just a fact. He'd stopped, he said, after losing someone. Marcos didn't press. He simply listened, letting the words settle the way Rain had just days before. River spoke slowly, his voice steady but distant, like someone describing a place they'd once known well but hadn't visited in years. When he finished, there was no reply, just quiet understanding. That night, Marcos couldn't sleep. But it wasn't restlessness, it was presence. A sense that he was no longer just observing this place, or this man. He was becoming part of it. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of that calm, something had started to move. The weather turned colder, as if the mountain air had decided to remind them of the coming shift. Mornings began with frost on the windows and breath made visible in the half-light. Marcos started wearing the same wool sweater every day, its sleeves permanently pushed to his elbows, the cuffs soft and fraying from use. He noticed River doing the same, an old denim jacket layered over thick flannel, his movements slower, more contemplative. Their conversations didn't change much in length, but there was a growing comfort between them, the kind that made silence less of a pause and more of space they shared. They fell into a quiet routine, one that felt less like coincidence and more like intention. River left fresh thyme and mint on Marcos's porch rail some mornings, and Marcos began bringing extra tea when they met near the greenhouse. They spoke in fragments, not always about meaningful things, but meaning somehow filled the space between each line. Still, there were boundaries neither of them crossed. Glances that lingered a second too long. Fingers that brushed while passing a mug. Moments where one of them would hesitate, as if about to speak, but then let the silence settle instead. Marcos couldn't remember the last time someone's presence had affected him like this. It wasn't passion, not in the dramatic sense. It was slower, quieter, like light creeping across the floorboards at dawn. It filled him before he even realized it was there. But it was becoming difficult to ignore. One night, the wind picked up, and with it came a restless kind of energy. The sky was clear, stars sharp and cold overhead. The cabin felt small that evening, so Marcos took to the porch with a blanket and a worn book of essays he hadn't opened in years. The words felt different now, more grounded, more true. He was halfway through a paragraph when he sensed movement beyond the edge of the trees. Not alarming, familiar. A minute later, River appeared, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable in the low light. He didn't say anything, just climbed the porch steps and stood at the railing. There was something different about him tonight, a kind of quiet pull, as if the space around him had changed, and Marcos could feel it, just enough to unsettle the breath in his chest. River sat beside him after a moment, their shoulders not touching but close enough for Marcos to feel the warmth radiating between them. The air was cool, scented with pine and damp wood, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, River asked about the book. Marcos handed it over without a word, and River flipped through it, stopping now and then to read a few lines. He returned it carefully, as though the object held something fragile. That night stayed with Marcos, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The next day, River was gone. Not for long. Just a full afternoon where he didn't appear in any of the usual places. Marcos tried not to notice. But the hours passed more slowly than they should have, and the silence felt heavier without a reason. When River did return, he offered no explanation, and Marcos didn't ask. Still, something had shifted. There was a hesitation in River's movements, a quiet held closer to his chest. They didn't meet on the porch that night, or the one after. For the first time since arriving, Marcos felt truly alone again. He tried to focus on his work, but the page remained blank. Not out of frustration, more like absence. Something had been present, filling the silence. And now it wasn't. On the third evening, the rain returned. Soft at first, then steady. Marcos stood at the cabin window, watching it slide down the glass in parallel lines. His tea had gone cold. His notebook was still closed. He felt suspended, held in place by something unnamed. Then came a sound. Footsteps on wet wood. He opened the door without thinking. River stood there, soaked through, his hair clinging to his forehead, jacket darkened by rain. He said nothing, didn't smile, but his eyes held something vulnerable. Tired. Real. Marcos stepped aside, But River didn't move. Instead, he took a slow breath, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small book, Marcos's copy of the poetry he'd once left behind in a city apartment years ago. River must have borrowed it from the shelf without asking. It was open to a marked page. River handed it to him, the spine slightly damp, and then turned to leave. He didn't go far, just to the edge of the porch, where the rain was loudest. He stood there looking out. Marcos didn't follow. He just sat down, book in hand, letting the rain speak for both of them. And something inside him whispered that maybe the things they didn't say mattered just as much as the ones they eventually would. The days after the rain felt different. The air was still cool, still scented with damp wood and pine needles, but there was a subtle change, something quieter, more watchful. Marcos moved through his routine as before. Tea in the mornings, long walks down familiar paths, reading by the fire in the evenings. But everything carried a weight now, a gravity that hadn't been there before. He hadn't seen River since that night on the porch. No footsteps, no glance across the garden, just a kind of absence that didn't feel like distance. It felt like waiting. On the third morning, Marcos found a note tucked between the pages of his notebook. No envelope, no name. Just a folded piece of paper left on his porch table. The handwriting was small, a little uneven. It said only one thing. Some things speak louder in silence. I'm still listening. He read it twice, then tucked it into the inside cover of his journal and left it there without comment. Later that day, he followed the trail that led down to the creek, the one River had once shown him early in their acquaintance. The air was clear, the light dappled. Moss softened every step. When he reached the overlook, he wasn't surprised to see River already there, sitting on a stone outcropping with his back to the path. Marcos didn't speak. He just sat beside him, close enough for presence, not contact. The water moved slowly below them, catching sunlight in small flashes. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, River reached into his jacket and pulled out a small book, his notebook, worn and weathered at the edges. He didn't hand it over, but opened it in his lap, flipping to a page already marked. He read aloud. Just a paragraph. A memory. Not about love, not about loss, something simpler. A moment from his childhood, standing in the rain waiting for someone who never came, and the strange calm he'd found in that waiting. It wasn't dramatic, just honest. Quietly raw. When he finished, Marcos didn't say anything. There was nothing to add, but he reached out, slowly, and rested his hand beside River's on the rock. Not touching, not yet. Just near. River looked down, eyes scanning the space between them. Neither moved for a while. The sun began to set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the water, turning the creek into a mirror of gold and slate. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out once, then fell quiet again. Marcos felt the breath leave his chest in a slow, steady release. Not because of tension, because he was finally still. When they stood to leave, River didn't pull away. He walked beside Marcos down the path, close but silent. At the fork near the garden, they paused. River looked at him, direct, calm, unreadable. Then he nodded and turned toward his cabin without a word. That night, Marcos sat on his porch long after the sky had turned black. The stars were scattered and soft, the air full of damp memory. He opened his notebook and began to write, not about science, not about logic, but about edges, about the invisible spaces between people, the thin lines that separate presence from connection, safety from trust. He wrote that sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that never fully arrive, the ones suspended between two heartbeats, two glances, two hands resting just short of touch. In the morning, he rose early. The frost was back, thin and glittering. The cabin was quiet, the kettle slow to boil. He stood by the window with a mug of tea, watching mist drift across the clearing like breath. At midday, River appeared. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stepped onto the porch and sat on the bench without invitation. Marcos joined him. They sat there as the sun crept across the floorboards and the silence settled between them again. Not awkward, not empty. River turned toward him just slightly, his arm resting on the back of the bench. His fingers grazed the edge of Marcos's shoulder, barely. A touch that could be explained away, but didn't need to be. Marcos didn't move. He just let it stay. And in that quiet moment, with no words exchanged and nothing resolved, he felt something open inside him. Not sudden, not sharp, just a soft shift towards something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. It wasn't about answers. It wasn't even about clarity. It was simply the acknowledgement that the line between them, whatever it was, whatever it had been, was no longer there. Only possibility remained. The morning moved slowly, as if the light itself had decided to pause. Sun filtered through the clouds in long, diffused shafts, turning the clearing outside Marcos's cabin into a pale mosaic of gold and shadow. The forest beyond was still, hushed, like it too was waiting. He brewed coffee, the sound of boiling water the only thing breaking the quiet. His notebook lay open on the table, yesterday's thoughts scrawled across the page in uneven lines. He didn't write this morning. Instead, he sat at the window and watched the trail that led from the greenhouse down to the old garden. At some point, River would appear. Marcos didn't know when, but he knew it would happen, and he wasn't wrong. Near midday, he heard footsteps, the soft, unhurried kind that only someone familiar with the terrain could make. River approached with a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder, his expression unreadable but calm. He didn't speak, just raised his hand in a simple gesture, something between greeting and invitation. They walked together through the thinning trees, following a path neither had spoken of before, but both seemed to know by instinct. It curved gently downhill, past moss-covered stumps and patches of quiet light, until it opened onto a small wooden dock stretching out into a narrow lake. The water was smooth, touched only by the occasional ripple from beneath the surface. They stood there for a moment. No sound but the breeze and the soft creak of wood underfoot. River sat first, legs crossed, his bag resting beside him. From it, he pulled 2 small enamel mugs and a flask. He poured. Marcos accepted the cup without comment. The drink was warm, spiced. It tasted like cloves and something darker beneath, something grounding. They drank in silence. The dock was old but sturdy. Weathered boards beneath them held years of stories. Marcos let his eyes follow the shifting reflections in the water, the mirrored sky broken only by falling leaves. He didn't feel the need to speak. Everything that needed saying seemed to already exist between them, layered in every glance, every gesture, every still moment they'd shared. River reached into his bag again, this time pulling out a folded piece of cloth, thin, sun-faded. A sketch lay beneath it, pencil on textured paper. The lines were delicate, imperfect, but clear. It was the porch of Marcos's cabin, and 2 figures, small but unmistakable, sitting side by side beneath the shadow of the roof. He didn't ask how long River had been working on it. He didn't need to. Marcos studied the drawing for a long time. Then he handed it back, careful not to smudge the graphite. River didn't take it. He simply smiled, small, real, and left it resting between them. They sat that way for hours, the sun arcing gently toward the trees. Occasionally, River would hum quietly, a tune without words, half-remembered and incomplete. Marcos found himself breathing in rhythm with it, his body relaxing in increments he hadn't known were still tense. At one point, River leaned back, his hand settling near Marcos's on the weathered boards. Not touching, not pressing, just there. Marcos let his fingers drift closer. The space between them disappeared like morning mist. No sudden movement, no dramatic pause, just the quiet shift of one hand sliding into another, the warmth of contact that neither tried to define. Their hands stayed like that, intertwined, resting, while the world continued around them. It wasn't about declarations. There were no confessions, no urgent claims. It was a presence, a choice made without needing to be spoken. As the light faded, they rose together and began the slow walk back. Neither of them said goodbye when the path split. Just a glance, a nod, and the weight of a moment that didn't need closure. That evening, Marcos wrote again. Not an essay, not notes, a letter. He didn't address it, didn't sign it. He simply wrote what he had no space to say aloud. About stillness, about unexpected arrivals, about how some collisions don't destroy. They make you see the pieces differently. He left the letter on River's porch before sunrise. Then he packed. 3 days later, the car waited at the edge of the clearing, engine humming softly. Marcos loaded the last of his things into the trunk, then stood for a moment, just breathing. The cabin behind him stood in its usual silence. The garden was quiet, the path empty, but as he turned to open the door, he saw it, tucked beneath the wiper blade. A single sheet of paper, folded once. On it, just 6 words. "I'll be where the water is." Marcos smiled, slid the note into his coat pocket, and drove away slowly, never once looking back.